Hello, Brian. Hello, John.
Hello,
Haley. Hello, John. And John, thank you for joining us from Atlanta. We want to point out that you're in front of a photo and not real daffodils, but they actually bloomed when you took them in January. Haley, John is a writer. He's an author of 3 books. His daily diary during the AIDS epidemic is in the Smithsonian archives, which is extraordinary to me because they have such high standards.
Mm-hmm.
And he spent his entire life after college working with, studying, writing about HIV and AIDS. And so I thought he'd be a great guest to talk about the hero's journey of seeing a challenge, leaving the comfort of his, master's in journalism, and heading into this epidemic.
Yeah, I'm still at the word Smithsonian because it's Smithsonian to me is one of those sort of sanctuaries of knowledge and wisdom. Mm-hmm. So congratulations, that's amazing.
Well, thank you. I mean, a couple of just minor corrections. I actually have authored 6 books, not 3.
Oh.
And I, for 35 years, focused on HIV AIDS, and then kind of wrote a subsequent book on resilience. And that sort of tied together, the themes that I observed and experienced for myself during the years of AIDS, as both an observer and chronicler, but also as someone affected as a friend and partner, and then eventually being diagnosed HIV positive myself in 2005. So yeah, I definitely know a little something about the hero's journey, my own and the journeys of so many other heroes that I've known.
Talk about, if you, go ahead, Haley, go.
I was going to ask, where were you when you sort of began sort of that journey with AIDS? Which city were you in?
Well, I was actually living in Boston in the summer of 1981. I was 22, not quite 23 years old. And that summer, of course, is when the first cases of AIDS, or advanced untreated HIV disease, as it's more technically and properly described, were reported among gay men. So literally, HIV AIDS has been a cloud over my entire adult life, my entire experience as a gay man, from literally the time I came out. Yeah.
And so for me and Haley, my question was the same, except John, why? I mean, there's so many issues you could have decided to write about. HIV was certainly one, but there are a lot of people out there, Randy Schultz, writing about it. What made you say this is my issue?
Well, it literally started while I was at Northwestern and, working on my master's degree in journalism, when I got word that 2 friends of mine, one in Boston, one in New York, had died from AIDS. One of them was 26 years old, the other was 30 years old, and I was 26 years old myself. So I was very affected by this, and scared, because like so many gay men, my friendships with these 2 men had included a sexual connection that eventually, we realized we were just friends. But nevertheless, those kinds of encounters sort of hung over your mind back in those days, and you thought, what did I do? And so anyway, it affected me, on a personal level, but also back then in 1985, before the internet, I was a news junkie. I was subscribing to like 5 daily newspapers and multiple magazines. So I was very aware of the growing AIDS epidemic and the impact that it was having on the gay community, my community. And so I just had a feeling that I really want to do something more than feel sad for my friends. What can I contribute? And how can I be involved? And in the fall of '85, I met a man named Bill Bailey in Washington, D.C., and we became boyfriends. But Bill, I have never known a man more passionate about something and more committed than Bill was to HIV and AIDS. And Bill kind of was the final push. And he said, essentially, it's your duty as a gay man who's a journalist to chronicle our community's experience.
Wow.
And I believed him, and it was what I needed. And I realized that my contribution to fighting against the epidemic, to spreading education and fact-based knowledge, was really being a reporter and writing about it. I describe myself as kind of an army reporter. I was there documenting the advances in retreats, medically and politically. So that was the role that I saw myself playing and making my contribution. Yeah, that was a long-winded answer.
No, that's like me. Yeah. Ask me one question, I can fill up the program.
John and Brian, in your experience with the AIDS almost generation, before it hit the news and before it sort of became mainstream media, were there inklings? Did you know that there was this sort of viral epidemic going on within any community? Or was it just when it kind of hit the news that you were like, oh boy, what is this?
I got a phone call. I was in 1982. So I was about 36 years old. I was the mayor's liaison to the gay community in Boston. So I was, I had my own office in City Hall. And a friend of mine from Minnesota wrote to me or called me, and he told me about Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And I actually have, my papers are at Cornell and their Human Sexuality Archive. I have the paper where I totally misspelled both words because, I had never heard them before. Mm-hmm. And that was my first awareness that there was something going on. And then once the awareness became, the National Gay Task Force, at the time it was just Gay Task Force, picked it up and ran with it, and Gay Community News, and suddenly there was an awareness. And so I started the mayor's liaison, the mayor's committee on AIDS in Boston. We brought people from the epidemiologists from the state and city level, and nurses and doctors and gay people, and wrote the first safe sex brochure. But that was the very beginning when AIDS Action started. And just one point before I toss it to John, is that I had, John, about 15 years of being gay without sex being an issue. Disease. I mean, there was gonorrhea and whatever else, crabs. But that was it. And you could get a shot for everything. Then came along HIV, and they called it the gay disease. How about you, John?
I first became aware of AIDS I can almost pinpoint it to December of 1981. And when I was doing the research for my book, Victory Deferred, I connected a lot of dots. And it was in December of '81 that the first medical articles about AIDS were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And at the same time is when Newsweek and I think Time Magazine published, their first big stories about this unknown, scary, deadly epidemic. But it was interesting as I did research for Victory Deferred, and I interviewed lots of people around the country. One of the people I interviewed was Dr. Larry Mass in New York City. Larry is an MD, and at the time, at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, Larry was writing a regular medical column for the New York Native, the gay community paper in New York. And Larry actually was the very first person ever to write about AIDS, this new thing, you know, this thing that there had been rumor of and people were hearing about in New York, even before the Centers for Disease Control's first published report on June 5th, 1981. And Larry started writing in the New York Native about this, and really provided some of the earliest medical coverage of this mysterious, you know, frightening new disease.
And this is Hayley, you're much younger than both of us. How did AIDS affect your life in any way?
Fear.
Fear?
You know, when I grew up in Zimbabwe and AIDS, you know, had the stigma of gay men, but mostly it was associated with sex and prostitutes and people cheating and people having sex.
Mm-hmm.
So it immediately struck that whole thing about having sex and what sex was, and sex is dangerous. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a wonderful segue, because the question I was going to sort of go with, you know, AIDS and sort of that generation, which I think, you know, is my generation too. We grew up with AIDS. And sort of that fear of, if you want to have sex, good luck. You know, it's a Russian roulette. And I think, you know, for me, and honestly, I just realized this as John was talking a few moments ago, sort of one of my fears of sex started with AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
As a girl, we were always taught that, you know, look after yourself, and men just want one thing, so save it for the one that really loves you. But then AIDS came along, and it was like, so there's that, and now there's this.
Yeah.
And anybody that got AIDS was very much put into that, well, that's your own fault, isn't it?
Yeah. How could you be so stupid?
Yeah.
When
you
all
were sneaking
literature,
around.
they're telling you to wear a condom, you know, how could you get it? You know,
And it was very much associated with people that slept around. So, you know, it was like if anybody found out that they had AIDS, you know, it was not only the fear of AIDS that they had to deal with, but it was the isolation of you're a dirty person. It's your own fault.
Yeah. John-Manuel Andriote. John, you're a Greek Catholic, correct? Or are you Greek and Roman Catholic?
My father was Greek Orthodox. My mom was Catholic, so I was raised in the Catholic Church.
Okay. How did mom and dad respond to, one, you being gay, and two, you deciding to make AIDS your career?
Well, I came out to mom first, and it was on Easter Sunday, 1983. And it was just one-on-one between us. And her response was, I just want you to be happy, which was really incredibly wonderful. And then, of course, it took years of education and kind of explaining things along the way. And I think that's how it goes. It's a process, you know, of people learning a new way to sort of understand you. Could take a while, but very supportive. I came out to my dad in 1987, only about a year and a half before he died at age 52. But his response was also pretty supportive. I mean, basically he said, as long as you don't get into drugs and don't tell your grandmother. But that was about it. And we didn't really talk about it very much after that until the very end of his life and our final conversation. and and we talked about it, and he said how proud he was of me. But I don't remember talking with them specifically about my decision to write about AIDS. But as I learned with friends of my mother's best friend, who was pretty homophobic, in her comments generally. But when Victory Deferred was published in 1999, it seemed that their pride in knowing an author kind of outweighed their homophobia. And that knowing me personally was, kind of a way of not having to drop their sense of homophobia, but, kind of he's a good one.
Yeah, he's a celebrity.
Yeah, and he's somebody we've known his whole life, and so I always felt I had their support. Absolutely.
Would you say, John, that your hero's journey started with your work in AIDS, or did you think it started earlier? And I know, like, sort of coming out of the closet is sometimes viewed as the beginning of the hero's journey, but I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, where was the beginning of your hero's journey?
Well, I feel like my hero's journey, at least my awareness of a journey, and then kind of attaching the meaning and connotations of the hero's journey to my personal life story, really began at the time of my HIV diagnosis in 2005. That's when I really looked back at my life and the events of my life that led me to that moment, that huge before and after moment in my life. And when I was writing Stonewall Strong, the book on resilience, I reviewed 40 years worth of my journal that I've been keeping for all these years, and kind of documenting important moments in my life, experiences, relationships, questions, challenges, losses. And I reviewed my journal, which is to say, I reviewed my life through the lens of resilience. So I was looking for evidence of resilience. Like, where did this confidence that I felt at the time of my HIV diagnosis, that somehow I will get through this? I don't know how, but somehow I'll get through it because I have a history of being a survivor. And so I wanted to know, where did that come from? And when I looked back, it really came from my very youngest years, growing up in Connecticut and kind of being trained as a boy by my mom to be a caregiver and the kind of person who sort of sucks it up, and really swallows his own pain and trauma with the interest of being strong for everyone else. So that was kind of the beginning, and I realized that the thing that had gotten me through the really traumatic years of AIDS, when all these friends of mine, all these close friends of mine were dying, when my father died, what got me through was that I had a history of disassociating from my own trauma and, staying pretty even keeled, when on the inside, there's terrible pain and sadness. So I think that's what got me through. And it was at the point of writing that book, beginning in like 2015, that I really examined all this, and I saw it as, the origins of my heroic journey, kind of where this journey toward becoming conscious of my own resilience and my own heroism, the strength and courage that had gotten me through all these things, I really came to understand where that came from and the terrible price that I had paid for it. But, the immense gratitude that I had also that it was the thing that enabled me to embrace life, when it really mattered for me, and to be as resourceful as I needed to be to figure out how the hell I was going to pay for these really expensive meds that suddenly were the difference between life and death. I literally knew what it looked like not to have effective treatment and not to adhere to it. So it really took everything I could, to focus on my own survival. And and I became aware very much, that this is my hero's journey that I've encountered, like the Greeks, and mythology. The hero's journey, you always encounter monsters and terrible creatures, and you ultimately emerge very changed from the person you started as. But that's part of it, part of it. And the hero always says, look at the monsters that I slayed, It's never about, oh, poor me, the monster attacked me. It's like, yes, I triumphed, and so that's kind of the spirit of, for me, of my hero's journey, is becoming conscious of my resilience, and then also realizing, like, I've got light to share with others, and that's what I love in my writing and everything, and talking about resilience, is I know how to be resilient, and I can share some of what I know with others.
What do you define resilience as?
I'm sorry?
What do you define, or how do you define resilience?
Well, I think resilience is really being able to, well, I use a lot of nature and gardening images, but, like a willow tree, which sort of blows in the wind, rather than a rigid oak tree, which stands up to the wind and then winds up breaking. So it's about being able to get through challenges with the consciousness that you will pull through it, and being able to draw on tools that you've used to pull through other challenges. For example, listening to upbeat music. I mean, for me, listening to happy dance music, going and swimming at the gym, taking a hike in the woods. I mean, those are all ways of getting me out of myself and into a place kind of being conscious of the bigger picture of my life, that I've survived many worse things, and I'll get through this too.
How did your childhood faith impact you, being Catholic? Did Catholicism impact you in any way, John?
I think my Catholicism affected me in the sense of really giving me a vivid imagination, of being able to imagine that there are mysteries, that there are ineffable things that we can only barely grasp to understand. And being able to appreciate the beauty of language. I mean, in the liturgy of the Catholic Church, of the prayers. And, even though I haven't been a practicing Catholic for many years, I still look at some of the prayers, in the Catholic or the Episcopal Church that I tend to go to when I go to church. And I think, these are the absolute most articulate expressions of this longing that we have for home, for the ultimate place where we are accepted and loved just as we are. And I think, The whole idea of the incarnation really inspires my imagination. The idea that whatever God is, whatever we think of as God, became human and validated human life and human friendships and relationships as essential to being whatever it means to be human, that those things are important to that. So I think that growing up Catholic, really inspired my imagination. So
It does.
I think that's positive.
Yeah, and coming out to your mother on Easter Sunday, when the rock was rolled back and Jesus, left the cave, and you coming out, I mean, the symbolism was boom.
Right. Right.
John, you mentioned imagination, and two of my favorite things right now is resilience and imagination, and really sort of exploring them and trying to understand them more. And one of the questions that I always kind of sit with is what makes some people more resilient than other people, and what makes sort of some people go on the hero's journey where some people are just like, not for me. And I was wondering, with imagination, do you think they go together, that people that have had experiences where they've either retreated to their imagination or have had fun with their imagination tend to be more resilient?
That's a good question, because for me, when I was growing up, part of what kept me resilient was, during the early teen years. I grew up with a father who drank too much and sometimes would become angry and violent. So, there was often a lot of screaming and crying in my house, and everybody's just kind of going crazy. And I would leave, I would escape and go out into the woods. And I would take photos, with my old 1960s camera of sunsets and trees and just beautiful things. And when I looked back, over my life and my journal, I realized that, that was an early attempt on my part to protect what I realized was this very joyful place in me, that I was a pretty happy kid. And ironically got my father's Greek Zorba spirit, but these people around me, were sort of really miserable and wanting to pull me into all the unhappiness. And so I instinctively kind of took myself out of that, into the woods by myself, kind of imagining new lives, sort of visioning what life could be like. And so imagination was very much a part of it. Another really important part, and I think this is the definitive sort of real secret sauce of resilience, and that is language and words and language that we use to speak to ourselves in our self-talk, the voice in our own mind, how we speak to ourselves about ourselves, and certainly how we speak about ourselves to other people, and how we frame our experiences. Again, if you frame the hero, Odysseus or Aeschylus or somebody encountering these, the Cyclops and these hideous monsters, if those men are saying, oh, the mean Cyclops, it was attacking my ship, it was a horrible thing. But instead they come out brandishing their swords and spears, and this monster is many times their size, but they stood up valiantly to it, and then lived to tell about it and framed the story as a very heroic story. Look what I survived, not look what happened to me. It's a very different way of thinking and how we think really becomes how we are, who we are.
Did you read those books as a child, John? Did you read the stories of Greek heroes as a child?
Well, as an older child, I mean, my freshman year of high school, we studied Greek mythology, and I was very fascinated, and particularly when I learned that my great grandmother, who I knew, my yaya, one of the original immigrants, in my family from Greece, her name was Persephone, just like in the myth, of Hades and Persephone. Persephone, I think, was the daughter of Aphrodite, goddess of love. And so having those names, the same kind of names that are in Greek mythology, certainly captured my imagination, my Greek heritage.
Yeah, go ahead, Hayley.
I was wanting to kind of switch back to your work and sort of documenting and chronicling AIDS. And I think one of the sort of core foundations of the hero's journey is not only resilience, but imagination, truth. Mm-hmm. How did you find it difficult, or how was your journey to maintain truth throughout the AIDS epidemic and to be able to chronicle the truth versus what, I would imagine in the political arena, there would really prefer a softer version of the story?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I would answer it by kind of comparing and contrasting. Maybe I will, be criticized for this by someone, but in Randy Schultz's book, And the Band Played On, about the first 6 years of the now 42-year-old pandemic, but the most famous book, about the AIDS epidemic, Randy used fictional devices to drive the narrative of the story. The most famous one was Patient Zero, which was used to provide a convenient way to show how this mysterious virus had spread, to peg it to one person, a man named Gaetan Dugas, a Canadian flight attendant, to say that he personally had transmitted HIV, across the United States and so forth. It was a great way to propel a novel, a fictional story. Mm-hmm. But as a journalist and someone who is supposed to deal in facts rather than fiction, my view of what Randy did was he didn't trust the power of the facts of the story. And maybe he wasn't a skilled enough storyteller to weave a compelling story from the real facts of a very dramatic story, the early years of AIDS and how it affected gay America. So when my book, Victory Deferred, was compared and contrasted with Then the Band Played On, that was the book it was most often likened to and contrasted with, when Jim Marks, then the founding publisher and editor of and director of the Lambda Literary Foundation, awarded Victory Deferred an Editor's Choice Lambda Literary Award. And what Jim said was, Randy Schultz chased the story, John-Manuel Andriote chased the facts, And for me as a journalist, that is the highest thing, praise that someone could give me, is that I stuck to the facts and I told a compelling, engaging story from those facts. I didn't rely on fictional devices to, propel the narrative. The narrative was there. It was up to me as a storyteller to find it in the facts. So that's how I stuck with the truth. And the reason I didn't soft pedal things, and I was condemned by some friends of mine in Washington when I held accountable the AIDS rides that were getting a lot of blowback because of the huge administrative costs, of putting on these massive AIDS rides, where a lot of money that people were donating to go to AIDS service organizations was going to Pilata and Associates for overhead administrative costs. So I was criticized by people I knew who were involved with the ride. How could you, as a gay man, criticize them? And I said, but the whole point is that if I, as someone who cares about this, if I don't call them out, then someone who is anti-gay, anti-HIV, they're going to come sniffing around those numbers too. And they're not going to be looking to protect the community and the AIDS service organizations. They're going to be looking for reason to, pass homophobic policies or whatever. So anyway, it was my sense of justice and fairness that, made me an equal opportunity holder to the fire. So, yeah.
Talk about your new book, Randy, and how it's different.
Stonewall Strong. Well, I describe Stonewall Strong, gay men's heroic fight for resilience, good health, and a strong community. I describe it as a bookend of Victory Deferred, where Victory Deferred chronicled and documented the suffering and the organizing and heroism of the gay community. Stonewall Strong looks at the lessons we learned about our own strength as a community and as individuals. This is what we learned from our suffering. This is the wisdom and strength that we learned we have. And now we're able to claim it, for ourselves and in our community. And so that's what Stonewall Strong is. It really celebrates the resilience of gay men. And, it has really incredible stories from people like Larry Kramer and Barney Frank, Bishop Eugene Robinson, the first openly gay bishop of the Episcopal Church. These men and many others, talking about the traumas of their lives, but including coming out, but how they evolved, to the point where they are able to be resilient and be role models of resilience to others. So it's a very positive book, it really celebrates the strength and courage. And I think that's one of the things that makes it different, is that it really frames our history and our lives through the lens of a heroic story, not the lens of society's victims.
I have a question for both Brian and John. And I think, the way that I understand this, Brian, is that you were already involved in sort of equal opportunity rights before AIDS came along, and then AIDS came along. And sort of, John, you then sort of became very proactive. For each of you, the question I have is, do you see the AIDS epidemic as being a hindrance or a help to those equal opportunity activisms and work that you were both involved in? When you look at it today, did it help or did it hinder?
From my perspective, it did both. I was doing corporate training when still in the mayor's office on gay issues in the workplace, gay and transgender issues in the workplace. And my host asked me to also talk about AIDS. And at that point in my life, I didn't want to, because I did not want people to associate gay with AIDS. In fact, one of the things that I would ask the executives who I was going to be speaking to, I'd ask them to take my book on being gay issues in the workplace and read it on public transportation before I arrived. I wanted them to have that experience. And the CEO of SC Johnson told me that when he pulled out the book, the man next to him got up and moved. And an AT&T employee said that when I pulled out the book, I had helped this woman put her bag in the overhead when she arrived, but she saw the book and she told me when we landed, do not touch my suitcase.
Wow.
So, yeah, so there was I was working really hard to make sure that the two issues, weren't linked. I mean, we would talk about the Haitians, we would talk about the IV drug users, we talk about how in the heterosexual community, as you said, Hayley, some people would go on the down low, have sex with a man, or stop at a truck stop and then go back to his girlfriend. And there was no awareness. So I would keep bringing up those examples because it was death to us in our movement of acceptance to work so hard to make sure heterosexuals didn't think of us in stereotypes, right? And we were getting to that point. And, I was in this book called Positive Images. And that's what we had hoped for. And then kaboom, right? And all the media was on gay death. Everyone interviewed in a hospital was a gay man, right? And so it became impossible to disassociate the two issues. On the other hand, AIDS brought to the front millions of people who never were involved in this issue, gay issues before. It brought gay and lesbian people out, and it brought heterosexual people out as allies. And the quilt that was made, and it's the largest folk art ever created in the United States. So I think it was turned around from you gay people, represent illness. God hates fags. What fundamentalist Christians would say, God hates fags. AIDS is God's wrath. They would hold up these signs. But, then people started thinking about, well, gosh, all you gay people are in the hospitals helping these people. And you're running all these marches and you're doing all this stuff. You guys are amazing, And we had to look at ourselves and say, as John says in Stonewall Strong, we are amazing. We did amazing stuff. How about you, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's my take on it. And, I'm very aware that many gay men, my age, I'm 64 and older, the AIDS generation, the people who really were, hardest hit by this in the 80s and early 90s, don't want to talk about AIDS because it's so painful and so traumatic. But, my response to that is yes. And none of us wants to revisit our trauma and feel all that sorrow again. But the way we can frame that story and that history is through this lens of our heroism, and look at how amazing the things that we accomplished, under absolute duress. But one of the things that has been really challenging, throughout the AIDS epidemic is how we walk that line between saying, no, this is not a gay disease. This is not something that only affects gay men, but at the same time, it's something that has disproportionately and profoundly affected gay men. The only simile, the only comparable experience I can think of is the Holocaust and Jews in the Holocaust. How, this line that has to be walked by saying, yes, millions of people, many people besides Jews were persecuted and killed by the Nazis, but yet Jews overwhelmingly and disproportionately suffered the Holocaust. So it's essential to showcase their unique experience while not losing sight of all the others, who were affected because of who they are. And so it's that fine line. I feel like in the gay community, it's like, no, this is not a uniquely gay disease, but it uniquely affected us in our community and brought us together in a way that may not have ever happened if there hadn't been this kind of cataclysmic event that we had to respond to. So I think, as concluding as Brian did, that the real lesson for me is that we were and are, a profoundly heroic community who practiced the absolute best traditional American values.
Yeah, that's the challenge, Hayley, of getting that message out. I mean, I write about it in On Being Gay and Gray, that we gay men have, and I'm focusing on that, have extraordinary gifts to offer. We have not been able to focus on it because we've been defensive our whole lives. We're not child molesters. We're not, dying of AIDS. We're not this. We're not that. And we have had very little time to say, this is who we are. And Hayley, John, you should know this. When Hayley and I first started talking, before we even pushed record years, couple years ago, 2 years ago.
Time is all one big, it was yesterday.
Yeah. Hayley said, she thought that gay men and women had a superpower. And here this is coming from a straight woman from Zimbabwe who's clairvoyant, but she picks up that there is an extraordinary strength there in not just coming out, but in dealing with all the issues that are thrown at you.
I think, and you mentioned something, John, that the AIDS epidemic very much highlights gay men and the experience of gay men. And, when we talk about the hero's journey, we always very much talk about the individual. And I think that this, as well as the Holocaust, very much shows us that the hero's journey is also at the collective. Resilience is also at the collective. And I think, sort of what we're starting to see now is that straight men are starting to have sort of their heroic journey sort of start bubbling up and kind of have the spotlight on them. It's, I think it's all part of our consciousness and the collective consciousness to keep moving towards better and better and better. And, the hero's journey, as we all agree, you fight monsters.
Hayley, you're so right about straight men being now in a position, never before, but now in a position of having to defend themselves and make the hero's journey. Straight women generally love gay men, because
we do. We feel very safe.
We're not interested in sex. We notice what you're wearing. We compliment your hair, and we talk to you as peers. We don't talk down to you. You're exactly equal. I agree
with you 100% on that. And I had an experience where I'm usually pretty good at sort of picking up whether a man is gay or straight or even bi. And I honestly thought this man was gay. And I was like, I have a friend. He hit on me. And I was just like, come on, right?
Yeah, why aren't you gay?
Really, I had that where I was just like, and sort of, I have been very much paying attention to the movement and the consciousness of straight white men since really Me Too started. And I have sort of been seeing that it's, the dial is being turned up, the water is boiling now. And all of those things that we were so afraid and so discriminatory against gay men, all of that now is being placed on straight men.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's an organization called the Mankind Project. Which has these weekend trainings that I actually went to as an openly gay elder. And it's all about who are we now since the women's movement happened, feminism and equality and the emphasis on women have to have a voice and we're not paying them enough. What about us? Who are we anymore? We're not even the breadwinners. In many families, women makes more money. The husband stays on. Who are we? House husband, right? So there's a search for identity, which is great. It's really important, right? Because evolution requires that we get past all these issues.
Yes.
We're dealing.
We froze for a second there, and I'm going to give it a second and hopefully it comes back.
Yeah.
I think we're back. We had a momentary moment to breathe.
Yeah.
We're all getting like really riled up.
And Hayley, one of the things John and I were able to talk during the freeze, and you had a beautiful smile on your face. I need to tell you that. Sometimes people get caught in the worst look in the freeze. But John is a really eloquent guy. You were on the speaking circuit, and you also, I want to talk about your children's book. You have a children's book out. So let's have a few minutes about John-Manuel Andriote.
Okay.
What is your children's book about?
Wilhelmina Goes Wandering. Here it is.
I have that.
Oh.
I'm assuming
the virtual background kind of blurs it. Wilhelmina Goes Wandering is based on the true story of a runaway cow in Connecticut who, for 5 months, traveled with a herd of deer and was mistaken by the animal control people as a bull rather than a cow because male Angus bull, well, all bulls are males, but Angus bulls typically don't have horns. So, and she was all black. The deer taught her to travel only at night. So the animal experts only saw her in the dark. So they couldn't see her udder. They couldn't see, her female cow part. So they mistook her for a bull. And the townfolk were calling her Waldo. And when they tried to trap her and she broke free twice, on the third time, they managed to trap her and tranquilize her and transport her to an animal sanctuary.
Why?
So that's the true story. And they realized that he was a she, and they started calling her Wilhelmina. This is the facts of the story. So I took the facts of the story. I was reading kind of updates on the cow in Milford, Connecticut, while I was still then living in Connecticut. And I was fascinated by this because I thought, how do the cow and deer communicate with each other? How do they know that they're safe together? Different species, and obviously they had a way of understanding each other. And so I let my imagination, wander, and I filled in the blanks. And I wrote the story about how the cow ran away because no one fully appreciated that she was really a free spirit, an adventurer, not just a lazy cow only good, to give milk. And so the deer were the first creatures, to recognize her free spirit and to affirm that. And so she set out on her hero's journey, literally. And the culmination was when she was captured and she was relocated to Betty's farm. And Betty is an imaginary character, the kind old Scottish farmer lady who knew the Angus breed back in the Highlands of Scotland, where the breed originated. And so from the moment Betty and Wilhelmina look in each other's eyes, they recognize kindred spirits. They're both free spirits. And, you know, ultimately Wilhelmina realizes that she has found her true home, the place where she is accepted and loved, that the gate in the pasture is always open, because Betty feels that love is what should keep you, not a fence. And so, so it's a story about a cow, you know, on what we could call her heroic journey toward embracing her truth, when she has the experience of being embraced by others. And of course, the animals talk, because in fables, you just assume that animals talk. And I love being able to use that fable, you know, sort of genre to tell kind of adult themes, you know, about running away from home to find your true home.
Animals do talk, just not in English.
Right, exactly.
They don't speak in our language, but they sure talk.
Well, gentlemen, I think that is a wonderful story to end on. We're actually like out of time. I know we could go on and on and on, because I don't even feel like we got into a lot of these topics.
Yeah, John, you're a great guest, and I think we should have you back.
Yeah, we have a lot.
Sure.
We have a lot more to talk.
Happy.
Thank you so much, John, for your time. Thank you, Brian. Sending lots of love to both of you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll speak soon.
All right, thank you. Please send me a link when this
I
is
will do.
posted. Or all right, very good.
Lots of love to you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.